In a previous tutorial, we described the 4 major process automation tools in Salesforce. And today we're going to look at flows. Flows is probably the most powerful tool of the 4, but also the most confusing and probably difficult to learn. So we're going to start with a simple case here. And what we'll do is we have an object called scholarships, and an account can have a lookup to scholarships. And so if we look at our related object here, we can see that we've got scholarships is related to accounts. And because we're thinking we're going to be adding a lot of scholarships, we want to create a form that we can utilize on the account to create a scholarship versus having to go to scholarships separately. And to start with, we'll just create a new flow and we will call it scholarships. And this version of the flow designer does use an old technology called Flash. And in the next release in 2019, Salesforce is releasing a HTML5 non-Flash version, which is going to be great. It'll basically work the same way. So at this point, we're using the old tool. And the first thing that we want to do is, actually before we start this, quickly, the reason why we use flows has to do mostly with the need to have user input. So that would be something like creating a form. You can also do other process automation type functions in flows, and you may even find yourself needing to do it, but for the most part, we can use other tools to do that. For instance, we can use Process Builder if we want to create a record or even update a field on a record or send out an email. And we can do similar things with workflow roles. And I'll talk about those later. But the main reason why we want to use flows is because we need to get some user input, or there needs to be a user interface for the user to interact with. And because of that, the first thing we'll do is we're going to many times add a screen onto the field, because that's really what we're trying to do. And on a screen, you have to name the screen. So we'll name this new scholarship, and it creates the unique name. And we don't want the header usually. We need the footer, and then we can allow finish on the screen because we're just going to do a single step screen. So we'll allow finish, previous and pause, it'll be fine. And now we want to add a field. And so in our object for scholarships, we can just look and make sure we know what fields that we want to add. And a scholarship is a pretty simple object for us right now. But at this point, it has an account. And so we'll show you how to look up the account, the amount awarded, the amount requested, the approval date, the contact, and the event date. So we'll take a couple of these fields just for simplicity. And the first thing that we'll look at here, I guess, is the name. So name is just going to be a text field, and we'll drag on a text box here, and we will call this name. And then the next field that we'll grab will be approval date. So that's going to be a date. So this is the date the scholarship was approved, approval date. Okay, and then we'll do one more field. We'll do amount requested and amount requested. And that's going to be a currency. And that'll be called amount requested. All right. So we'll just do 3 fields for now for simplicity. And we'll hit OK. Okay, so now what we want to be able to do, though, is we want to be able to on our account, we want to be able to um, pass the ID of the account into the form. And so this is a bit tricky, and I hope I don't get too doesn't get too confusing. But essentially what we're going to do is create a variable, okay? And this is where we can start to see the power of flows. It really, as a programmer, I understand flows easily, but because really what I'm doing is the same types of things that I'm doing when I'm programming. And one of the things that you do a lot in programming is use variables. And a variable is really just a holding place for a piece of data. And in algebra, you know, it's kind of you represent a variable by x. And so there's usually a name for that variable, and that name represents some information. So in this case, we're going to call this the record ID, okay? And what we're going to do is make sure that we can have this record ID be input and output. And the reason why is that we're going to pass in the ID to this flow from the account, okay? So what happens then now is from that variable, so if we go to our Explorer, we'll see our new variable here called record ID. So what we want to do, and I'll show you how we pass that in to our flow in a minute, but what we can do is we can look up through the fast lookup right here, we can look up the account from that variable. So we'll call this an account lookup. And we are going to look at a standard object, and the standard object is going to be account. And the field is going to be a standard field called ID, and we can even search here, ID equals, and we're going to choose, now we can create a new variable right here, but we already created it, and the record ID is the variable that we want to create. So we're actually doing a query here, which is kind of crazy that you'd have to do quite a bit of programming in SQL to grab a record, and we don't have to do that in this case. We can just point and click declaratively and do what we want. And now we need to say, okay, where do we want this resource to sit? What variable do we want to put this in? So we're going to look up the account, and we want the information for that account to sit somewhere. So we're going to put that into an S-object variable. And we're going to call that S-object variable, we'll just call it account. And we'll make it private because we really only want to access that here in the flow. And the object type will be account. So if you had a different object, you'd obviously choose a different object there. And so we're going to say, okay, and then sometimes I do like to do this assign null if there's no variable records found. It just creates this variable with a null value, and that a lot of times will allow the flow to continue without erroring out. Okay, so then what values do we need in this to save from this account? Really, at this point, we don't need that many variables or information. This is a very simple flow. So at this point, I'm just going to grab the ID. You can see where in the future, though, you might have all sorts of other account information, account number, different variables that you can store and use in your flow. But in this case, all we need to do is create a simple variable for account ID. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to join this first lookup to our screen, and I'm going to make this the starting point. And you need a starting point in a flow. So when the flow runs, this will be the very first step, is we're going to look up the account from the account ID. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to ask the user for a couple of fields of information. And then the last thing we want to do is update. I'm sorry, we wouldn't create, because what we're doing here in this case is we're actually creating a new record. In this case, it's going to be a scholarship record. And so we're going to say create scholarship. And we're going to create a new object here, and we're going to call it scholarship. Okay, and it can be private, and it's going to be of type scholarship, which I can search. Okay. Great. So that's going to be the place that we actually create our scholarship. But before we can create the scholarship, we need to do an assignment. And the assignment is going to be called assign, or maybe set, we'll call it set scholarship. Okay. And what we're going to do is take our account variables, and we're going to set the values for that scholarship. So the first thing that we want to set is the account, and the account is going to be equal to our account ID that we set in the very first step. Then we will also set the amount or approval date is going to be equal to, now this was a screen field, right? So we actually created this field on the screen so you can see there's screen input fields. So since we created that, it only showed us the date fields from our form because this is actually a date field, and we only had one date field, so that was easy. And the next one is going to be the scholarship amount requested equals, and this is going to filter those values because we know this is a currency field. And then the last one that we want to create is, let's see, actually, what was the last one? The last one is, the name. I knew there was a third one, the name. Okay. So now we're going to say scholarship name equals the screen input of name. Okay, so now we've set to our variable the values from our input fields here, and then from the value that got set when we ran the very initial step on the flow. So all of our variables are set, and so after the user enters the information, we're going to set that information to the scholarship object, and then we're just simply going to update that. Or, I'm sorry, create that. We're going to create the object. So sometimes we actually will do more steps, but at this point, for speed, we'll just call this what we want to do. So now what we want to do is we just want to save this, and we will call our flow scholarship create. Okay, now it's going to be of type screen flow. There's other options here that we can maybe go into at a later date, and then we'll just save that. Now, basically we're ready to go, and it is sometimes helpful to do a debug if you want to test your flow. And we are passing in the record ID for the account, and so if we do want to test this, we need to just copy from your URL string up here and account ID. And I know this is a bit confusing, but every place in Salesforce, when you're looking at a record, you'll see this ID. So you can see it's an account, and we're viewing that account, and this is the ID. So you don't have to do this very often, but it is sometimes helpful to, when you're debugging, to just go ahead and pass in that ID. So we'll run the latest version, and we want to show the details. And it's asking us, because we know this is an input variable because we set it to be in the flow, we're just going to run it with that account ID passed in. Okay, so now you can see this is a sample flow. And if you look on the right here, you can see where it's trying to find that account based on the ID. And so it looked up the record ID because we passed it in, and then it found it and assigned the values to that account variable that we created. And you can see the result was that it successfully found the records. So this is going to be, call it test scholarship. And we'll make the date today. And then we'll say $100. So now we can see here that we had, this is why we like to do the debug. And so what happened here, it says this error occurred when the flow tried to create the records. Field filter validation exception. Value does not exist or does not match the filter criteria. So it failed to create the records because there was a required field that wasn't set. You don't get this detail when you're just trying to run the flow. And one of the things I'm just going to look at here is which one of these fields. I think we must have set one of these as required. Maybe the contact. No? Not that one. We're passing the approval date. Nope, not the event. Event date. No, event sponsor. Scholarship name we're setting. Of course, we have that. Value does not exist or does not match filter criteria. So the value is amount requested, account, approval date, and name. I'm curious, so one of the things I can do here is we can just go into scholarships and enter those values and see what happens. So we'll say test, and we'll go, I'm going to leave contact blank because we don't necessarily need that. We're going to actually search for the account that we were using. The account we were using was called Advantis. Why didn't that show up there? Ah, oh, that's interesting. So this is cool. So what happened here is when we set up this object from a previous lesson, what we did was we are filtering the account to only show member. So we have this filter criteria that says that the record type on account needs to be member. And so if we look at our record here in Advantis, we'll note that Advantis is not a member. And so we're only making the scholarships available to members. And so you can see here, if we change this, we can change this account type, but we're not going to change it. We're going to actually go to an account that actually is a member. And in this case, this account type, the record type, it is member. So let's use BECU as our account type. I'm sorry, as our sample. So let's go back and run our flow again. And we're going to say test scholarship. And then we'll set the approval date. And then we're going to, sorry, when we do this, we have to rerun it again. I need to close it and rerun the debug because we have to reset that account ID. So I'm going to paste in now this new account ID. That's the correct membership type. Scholarship test and approval date. And we're going to say 100. And now we don't get an error message. We can see that the records were created in our test. Okay, that was actually good debugging there. Those are the types of things that happen. And it's good to test that, obviously, because we want to make sure that our flow can actually create records. You might actually provide some better debug on that. And because really what we want to make sure is that we don't try to create scholarships for non-members. And so what we'll do here, so let's go into, we're in our account here. So now let's make this usable by people when they enter, when they're on the account. So we'll go to edit page. Now, what we can do is we can grab that flow here and we'll put it right here at the top. Actually, let's put it below our activities. So we'll put our flow here, and then we're going to, okay, so the first thing is I have to activate that flow. So we're going to activate this, and then now that that's activated, then we can come back here and refresh our page builder. And we'll put the flow on the page. Okay, so it only has one that we have created, so it defaults to that. And so now pass record ID into this variable. So now you can see why we named that variable record ID. And you notice the capitalization on the R and the I. And so we're going to pass in the record ID because we're in the record that we want to pass. It's the account record. So we're going to pass in that record and into the flow. Now, remember I mentioned that we only want this to run for members. So this is awesome. We can actually set the visibility of our component based on a field. So in this case, what we want to set it on is based on the record type. Count record. See, I might have to go into the advanced there. But not type. This is going to be account record type, and we're going to choose the name, and the name is going to be equal to member. We'll make it equal. So we can see here record is the record we're in, and the record type names, the name of the record type equals member. So now we can save this, go back. We are in a member record here, BECU, and you'll notice that we have a flow. Yay! If we go to our other non-member, if we click over here, you'll notice that that is not available. We cannot create scholarships for that account. So let's go back to our other record, BECU. Let's just go ahead and create a scholarship. Scholarship test Approval date today. Amount requested is $101. Okay, so now you'll notice that that was created successfully because we can go over here to the related objects, and guess what? We have the record that we created as our test, and we have our next test here too. So we can create multiple different records like this really fast, and then maybe we want to show them right here. I've shown this in a previous lesson to create a tab, but let's go ahead and review that. We'll edit our page object. We will click on the record layout, and we'll create a tab here called Scholarships. It's going to be a custom tab, Scholarships, and we're going to drag it up here. And so now we can see our Scholarships tab here. And so we're going to drag onto the list a related list, single rated list, and we'll choose scholarships, and we're going to use this account to look up those scholarships, and we'll just choose the default layout. And so now if we save this, then we can have all of our new scholarships be very visible. Now, the other option is to actually put this flow right at the top of the scholarship section. Might be a nice place to put that as well. I'm not sure which place is better, but we can do that as well. So if we go back to our record and we click on scholarships now, not only can we see the existing ones, but we can actually create them all in the same tab. So this is so powerful, and what we can do, what we did in just 15 minutes, we created really a whole form and saved values from that form quickly to the database, and without very much work. So yeah, in the future we'll go over some of the other process automation tools, but Flows is very powerful when we're looking at creating data in Salesforce.